Jeff and Clark.
Thank you. I'm going to have the opportunity to actually be able to fill in some of the things that you heard, and both that John and Ron talked about in San Francisco, and Jeff and I are going to talk about a lot of things that our firm has been doing and what's actually evolved in San Francisco. The history here in terms of sustainability is really about 20 years old in my mind, and a lot of things that are really important here are about some of the precipitating events. And some of you may know, in 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake was really one of those things that changed the way the character of the city began to be developed in terms of what the residential communities are, and you see what happened there, and people were obviously very concerned with what happened. And what really transpired was the area in the middle there, which was a series of elevated ramps, got demolished in the course of a planning process. It took a long time, 85. Citizens in the city really were talking about could they remove it, and then they decided that they couldn't remove it, but the earthquake was a precipitating event. Columnist Herb Cain always thought San Francisco was one of those places where Manhattan was a bad thing, and now we're looking back 20 years later and talking about very tall buildings in terms of San Francisco, clearly not in terms of what we would see here in Dubai, and so height's a relative thing here. You see in this diagram here over the four images here in terms of the way the city's involved in this height dialogue, and it's really been pretty dramatic, and it's really accelerated significantly in the last 20 years. The area that we're really going to focus on is the area around the downtown core, and the core discussion started in 1985 with the downtown plan. It was centered around that black area, and there was a desire to really move some of the development that had occurred north of Market to the southern portion of the area with the financial district. And the discussion then, as this ramp, which you see in the middle there, as it got demolished, two areas got created, and I'm going to talk to these. One is Rincon Hill, which John touched on, and the other one is Trans Bay. 1982. So we get up to 1982, and with the removal of the elevated Embarcadero Freeway, this is what actually began to happen. Very much like in the Chicago model with the waterfront experience, much smaller scale, it really began to change the character of it. And the area that you see that's on the left there is the area where we'll be talking about in terms of what this new residential was. So the first thing that happened was the waterfront got changed, the elevated freeway got changed, parkland got created on that waterfront. Pedestrian experiences were created, pedestrian was emphasized, and a lot of the pedestrian character that's really important to the character of the city, which is a city really of only 800,000 people, a world city that a lot of people really love to come to because of its pedestrian character. And so the area that's sort of on the left that you see there, again, is something that has not yet happened now, and we're about 1995. So in 1996, the city began to think about a plan for both transit in the core of the city in terms of bringing mass transit there in a more significant way, and the development of two adjacent areas. One was Rincon Hill and one was Trans Bay. Two separate agencies actually, remarkably, were charged with two different parallel courses. One was the City Planning Department, who was charged with the review of Rincon Hill, and the Redevelopment Agency with Trans Bay in terms of the ability to get revenue for that area in terms of its development. The area that's in the red zone there is the Trans Bay and Rincon Hill combined areas, and you see actually that it's now south of where the central core of the commercial district actually was evolving, and so it was seen as a new residential enclave. Two dots there, and I'm going to touch on the two projects that precipitated this, and they actually were prior to the ones that John's firm actually were dealing with because they were done before the zoning for Rincon Hill actually started. We started this project in 1999, almost 10 years ago, and the project's actually finally coming online. And the desire to increase heights by almost twice from about 200 feet to 400 feet was really seen as a very difficult discussion for the community. I spent 80 community meetings in the course of a 3-year period going around the city talking to people about why it was important. A lot of them understood, a lot of the environmental community understood, but they were still concerned about the desire to increase that height. So now we're at about 2003, and the redevelopment plan and the Rincon Hill plan became much more of a public discussion, and these are the areas that John had touched on that were part of this discussion, and they were important to this dialogue. This is the area as you saw it before the development occurred. This is actually what's begun to happen here, and the areas that begin to see is the development of parks, the creation of a retail boulevard along Folsom Street, which one runs to the waterfront, and the development of several residential projects, two of them, one that you'll see now, actually three, Millennium, Infinity, and one Rincon are three of the major projects that have actually started in this area. So again, Rincon Hill, you see the rendering on the right that the area was focused on. It was part of the vision of the city. This is that creation of that boulevard that actually ran down to the waterfront from the area that was west of the commercial district, the creation of living streets and open space. That was an important part of what didn't typically occur downtown. This was a change in the mindset that actually people could live downtown and create a new residential enclave. And then one of the discussions that actually occurred early on was the discussion about the size of the buildings and the floor plates. Planners in the city actually felt that the Vancouver model was something that they felt was important to do, and you see the massing and the size, but they were very thin buildings, which is really a difficult thing for developers, as well as a very difficult thing to accommodate in this development of this performance-based structural system. Which Ron touched on. And this project, Infinity, was actually the first to use this system and the first to be constructed. One Rincon benefited by this because we took a lot of the effort here. And the diagrams that are on left and right, one shows the Vancouver model, which permitted switchback stairs and exiting through elevator lobbies. The San Francisco Code did not permit that to happen, so therefore it meant that the floor plates actually were bigger than they could be if the planners were actually looking at the Vancouver model. They didn't quite understand that the building codes were part of that discussion. This was also the comparison that I think is important that Steve talked about here is the Millennium Tower on the right and the Infinity Tower on the right about the perimeter beams. Ron and I had worked on a project much smaller in scale, 240 feet in height, that had no perimeter beams. And I felt in the course of the development of this project that it was important that we did not have those perimeter beams. We wanted the greatest flexibility that could occur. And it took almost 3 years for the building department to actually understand and give us a yellow light about the approval of this project. Jeff will touch a little bit more on this in terms of the development of Trans Bay and how it ultimately will evolve in the changing of this area. And so we're at about 2005, the importance of the streetscape that we talked about. And now we've now sort of advanced the discussion. The height is a better thing. The development of this area is important. And now the city's in the process of looking at bigger and taller buildings. Jeff will also talk about the transit tower that's a part of this discussion, a competition that was recently won by Hines and Pelly to build a building of probably somewhere around 1,000 feet. So that's a big change in the mindset. And you see this form of the building and the tower. This is really that sequence of images which I always thought was important in terms of the way the city began to think about the development of the base, the entitled towers, the proposed Trans Bay towers, the opportunity sets that they thought for development, and ultimately a balance of what they thought the development is. So in the course of it, what I would describe now as a 20-year process from the removal of an elevated freeway to development of a higher, increased density in the core of the city was actually very important. So the city followed the intent, and I just want to go back to the thing that John talked about, which I think is really important in the way the city is seen is suburban versus urban. The density on the Infinity site, which I'm going to talk about, is 660 units to the acre. And so if you compare the single-family house, it's significantly better, and the city is now beginning to attract a lot of people in this area. So this is a little discussion about the Rincon Hill area in Trans Bay, what it's occurred in the area. You see how actually many of the open lots were there prior to the development. We're just sort of working our way around it. And this is a series of animations that the city developed in terms of they're looking at what the key vantage points. So this is the baseline. This is the Trans Bay and Infinity and 201 Towers. This is the development of the Rincon Hill and Transit. And then these are different vantage points that the city felt were important that they look at. And you can see the way the change in this sort of man-made topography compared to the natural topography of the city was seen as an opportunity. The Infinity Tower, which I'm now going to just sort of touch on, is one of the projects that is a part of this, and this is a shot taken actually from one Rincon on a visit that Jeff and I had the opportunity, and it's a 660-unit project, about the same scale as one Rincon. 2 towers, 2 mid-rise buildings, an open space in the middle of the courts, and 5 levels of parking below grade. Very, very dense project, very unusual, very big for the city. And it allowed, as you can see in this, the use of this curtain wall, which gave the flexibility for this unit configurations. And you can see the way the character along the street was really important to us in terms of the way people moved around the site. This is one of the ground floor plans. This is the courtyard plan that you can see in the middle, the way the space is created between the buildings. And then some of the views from the streets and the in-progress construction site, and a view looking down Folsom Street. Remember, I was talking earlier about that view there. Next thing I just want to touch on briefly, which I think is a really important part of this Congress, is about sustainability and what ordinances are about and why incentives are really important. San Francisco is one of those cities that I think, we talked about earlier, or we heard the presentation earlier about Chicago. San Francisco is seen as actually the #2 city in terms of green, and the thing that actually has been interesting is watching the land use zoning create the ultimately goal of what sustainability is about, and it's seen as that. In the last year, the city and the mayor put together a task force of community, construction, architects, engineers, and people who could actually provide insight into what sustainability meant. We'd always been on this course to making it a sustainable city, but this is a concrete example of actually where this implementation could occur. So when you look at this sort of chronology that goes back to 1997, each one of them was about the way the sustainability plan occurred, and the most recent one now is one that provides incentives for private sector owners to decide that they want to do their building as potentially LEED Gold. The incentive legislation is in the process of being considered by the Board of Supervisors. The intent, obviously, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the best way they can, as well as primarily energy. In looking at this also, this case study here, the city also was looking at the way it could also use PVs in the course of, using the convention center as an opportunity to be able to do that. This chart here is the matrix from this initial report that looks at the way this incentive would actually be implemented, and you can see in each of the dates starting in 08 through 12 that projects of different scale would be able to be implemented in their ability to be able to be some level of LEED conformance, and most of the sentiment has been that the commercial buildings are easier. Those of you who do residential buildings understand that it's harder, and those who really understand what California is like is the energy codes are very difficult to do, and the project sponsors actually challenged in doing that. This was the general benefits that the city saw in terms of what they could achieve out of this legislation: CO2 reduction, drinking water, waste reduction, construction, recycling. All of them were all part of the assumptions about what this legislation could be. And then the comparison in the chart, actually, which I always find interesting, is in terms of what the other cities have been doing, including Chicago, Austin, and the ones that have been out there forever. The other part of this that I have actually had the opportunity to be involved in is as a vice president on the AI National Board. The AI has now become much more active in terms of trying to provide guidance in federal legislation on this. And this chart actually is a good one that actually shows where the green building programs have been implemented across the United States. And you obviously, from reading a lot, you see where that, and California is obviously pretty far out in front of it. It tends to look at the federal level and not necessarily ascribe to what its views are, and thinks that it could actually move forward, and it's done actually very effective in doing this. This chart here also talks about this change in green buildings in terms of the years, and you see the steep incline in terms of interest in doing it, increased interest on the part of developers in doing that, and understanding what the opportunities are. And this is actually a chart then of what the pre-2003 program are. So we're talking 5 years ago. We were at an infant stage in terms of what this development is, and it's begun to accelerate at a pace that, in my mind, that's somewhat scary, because I think that a lot of the quantitative quantitative information that we all are, we need to use in everyday practice is still not quite there. We talk a lot about the rhetoric, but really we now talk about how we can implement this stuff. Two cities, Ron probably will appreciate this, Seattle and Arlington are two of the cities in the course of the study that the AI did that are about incentives associated with height. Seattle obviously much taller, Arlington, Virginia much smaller, but both of them have been focused on using height as an incentive on doing greater sustainability. And then sort of lastly here, in just trying to summarize some of the things that I touched on in terms of this, the AIA also has been involved, and you see towards the bottom there, at the end of 2007, was a big proponent of trying to create carbon neutrality targets in the 2030 challenge that some of you may know about. That's in federal legislation for federal buildings. And actually last week, the House of Representatives passed an additional piece of legislation, and it'll go to the Senate on extending the renewable energy for that. So then when you look at the 50 greenest cities, you look at the cities that are on the top 10 here, it's interesting to see where you've heard a lot about Mayor Bloomberg talk about New York. It's actually only 20 on this list. The top city for the last 30 years has actually been Portland, Oregon, and then San Francisco is seen as number 2. And really what we're talking about here is we're talking about the ability for things that are not just about buildings, but are about the whole aspect of that. And the survey that was done here, which obviously is something that seems very simple to many of us, is about the public's continued support about sustainability and why they think incentives is an important thing. Jeff, that's yours.
This is a classic shot of San Francisco and the fog rolling in, and it strikes me that what we're all here about and what many of us have come here from halfway around the world about is quality of life. And sustainability is ultimately quality of life issue and where we're at. The basic point here is that quality of life used to be about oneself and not in my backyard, and now it's become about the planet. And San Francisco, Clark's gone through the history of it, but just to get to the guts and the emotion of it, San Francisco is a very pretty place by the bay. Its zoning over the last couple of decades up to now has been about preservation of what's there. The project that Clark talked about, which was the Infinity done, our office with Architectonica, was a ferocious fight over a 400-foot height limit. And as you'll see, that height limit became quite irrelevant when the idea of sustainability of the planet became a more important issue than whether or not your backyard was imposed on by somebody else. And you've seen this project, and this project creates a whole new height. So in the foreground there, just behind the seawall of the city is the Infinity, and then beyond it is One Rincon. And you can see the scale jump. And here's this photograph from One Rincon, which Clark also showed. But the point here being that One Rincon, which was fought over for years, is really a minor statement by comparison to what is now going on. So the studies in the city, which first were here, now contemplate taller buildings, and you'll see taller yet. And it's because of the notion of sustainability. The Trans-Bay Plan itself, which was like this, is really quite modest in light of what has now happened. And we have here a 400-meter building by Hines and Caesar Pelli, where before 600 feet or 200 meters or just below that was contemplated. In our office, we have a model of all of this, and you can see that the scale is jumping in San Francisco, and it's about, again, high-rise and quality of life in urban centers to help preserve our planet. Now, this is a fairly recent project by us. This is about 300 meters tall, and it's right near the Trans-Bay Tower. And the idea of the project here is that it tears down from the Trans-Bay in urban design to create a transition. And here it is immediately south of the Trans-Bay Terminal itself. And the concept of the building is an exoskeletal building. It's a seismic zone. It's a very small floor plate. So we're expressing the structure on the outside of the building in order to have column-free space inside. It's mixed use, probably office with residential above, perhaps hotel also. And to emphasize the structure, the exoskeletal structure, we have this subtle shifting of the planes and surfaces of the building to give a bit of character to that structure. The other idea we have going for this building is that we have a serrated wall, and the reason for the serrated wall we've designed is that the sun strikes the mullions to a higher ratio than the glass, and this we've calculated to save about 6% on the energy for the building. And we also are taking advantage of some of the recent wind studies, so we create a funnel through an amenity floor to break up the wind currents and reduce the stress on the building and do some wind turbines. And here you can see the way the plan transitions through the amenity floor to the top, the base, the middle of the building at the amenity floor. And then one last quick project. This is not so tall, but again, being very respectful. It's on the right there near the Transamerica building, and yet create a whole series of sustainable statements in a residential tower, which does a quarter twist as it transitions from the bottom to the top. And you can see the way the geometry created works fairly sensitively with the edge of the Transamerica building while not mimicking the building. There it is in its context. And here you see the way that transitions from the square to around, resulting in a building like this, which means that the park space is kept quite open, the sunlight is kept quite illuminated, and creating interesting geometries from the inside looking out, where the vertical glass is where the doors to the balconies are, but otherwise we work with the geometry of the idea. These are some studies of the building in context. As Tim mentioned, this is a very contextual city. And then in the park, we open the park up more because of that. Let me just go back to this, and I'll close there because of the interest of time, and say I was talking to our colleague Igor Tartakovsky, and one of the other things is that a round building presents less of a face to the sun. It's a more efficient volume, so there's less perimeter as well. So there's considerable savings just by virtue of the fact that it's a round rather than a square or rectangular building. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.